You shouldn't be in here. This floor is reserved for families who actually belong at this level. The words cut clean through the quiet hum of the executive lounge on the 42nd floor of the Hamilton Grand in Midtown Manhattan, and every conversation within 20 feet slowed just enough to notice. Naomi Ellington didn't look up immediately. She sat at the edge of a polished walnut table, her fingers lightly resting on a leather folder, her posture calm, composed, almost too composed for someone who had just been publicly dismissed. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the late afternoon skyline stretched across Manhattan, golden sunlight reflecting off glass towers, the kind of view reserved for deals measured in hundreds of millions. Naomi glanced briefly at her watch. For minutes, the elevator bank chimed softly behind her, but she didn't turn. Across from her, Tyler Whitmore leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he had just delivered a clever joke at a private dinner. His mother, Evelyn Whitmore, lifted her espresso cup with delicate precision, her eyes scanning Naomi's sneakers, her simple navy blazer, the absence of designer labels. "I'm just saying," Tyler added, loud enough for nearby executives to hear. "This is a $750 million negotiation, not a college internship waiting room." A faint ripple of polite laughter spread from the Whitmore side of the table, subtle but unmistakable. Naomi inhaled slowly. The scent of roasted coffee beans and polished wood filled the air. She had smelled rooms like this her entire life. Rooms where wealth whispered instead of shouted. Rooms where assumptions spoke louder than introductions. She adjusted the leather folder slightly, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. 3 minutes. "Are you waiting for someone?" Evelyn asked, her tone sweet but edged, the kind of sweetness that felt rehearsed. Naomi met her gaze calmly. "Yes," she said. Tyler tilted his head, amused. "Let me guess, an assistant." He glanced toward his father, Richard Whitmore, who sat reviewing documents with a gold pen, barely acknowledging Naomi's presence. "You know, these negotiations require credentials." Naomi didn't respond. She simply looked back toward the skyline, her reflection faint against the glass. She had seen this before. The looks, the tone, the subtle dismissal wrapped in politeness. At 12, she'd watched a country club host ask her mother if she needed directions to the service entrance. At 15, she'd been told she couldn't possibly belong in a leadership conference reserved for legacy families. Each moment had carved something quiet and resilient inside her. 2 minutes. A junior associate standing near the coffee station glanced at Naomi's folder, then at the digital meeting board on the wall. His brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Tyler leaned forward, tapping the table lightly. "You know," he added, lowering his voice, but not enough. "Security downstairs is pretty strict. I'm surprised they let you up here without verification." Evelyn smiled faintly. "It happens. Sometimes people wander into places they don't fully understand." Naomi's phone vibrated softly in her hand. She glanced down. One message. She read it once, then placed the phone back on the table. 1 minute. The elevator chimed again. Footsteps approached from the hallway, measured, unhurried, confident. Naomi remained seated, her expression calm, her eyes steady, as the sound of polished shoes echoed across the marble floor and the entire room began, slowly, almost instinctively, to fall silent. The footsteps slowed as they reached the edge of the conference lounge, and the subtle shift in the room felt almost physical, like the air itself tightening with expectation. Naomi did not turn immediately. She already recognized the cadence. Calm, measured, deliberate. The kind of walk that did not ask for attention but always received it. Tyler Whitmore glanced over first, his smirk fading slightly as he tried to identify the approaching figure. Richard Whitmore finally lifted his eyes from the documents in front of him, adjusting his glasses as the man stepped fully into view. He wore a charcoal gray suit tailored with quiet precision, no flashy watch, no oversized logos, just understated confidence. Marcus Ellington did not rush. He moved with the steady composure of someone who had walked into rooms like this for decades. Naomi stood slowly as he approached, her expression softening just slightly. "You are right on time," she said calmly. Marcus gave a small nod, his eyes briefly scanning the room, then resting on the Whitmore family for a fraction of a second before returning to Naomi. "Traffic on Park Avenue," he said quietly. Elevators were faster. The junior associate near the coffee station straightened immediately, recognizing him, but remained silent, unsure whether to interrupt. Tyler leaned toward his mother, whispering under his breath, "Another consultant?" Evelyn gave a polite smile, already assuming the same. Richard Whitmore extended a hand. Halfway, still uncertain. "You must be early," Richard said cautiously. Marcus shook his hand politely, but did not introduce himself yet. Naomi remained standing beside him, her posture relaxed, her confidence unchanged. The digital board on the wall displayed the meeting title in clean white letters against a dark background. Whitmore Capital and Ellington Infrastructure Group Strategic Partnership. Tyler's eyes flicked toward the board, then back to Naomi, confusion briefly crossing his face before he dismissed it. "We were just waiting for the primary decision-maker," Tyler said, his tone returning to casual arrogance. Marcus nodded once. "So was I." The room quieted again. Outside, the sunlight dipped lower, casting long reflections across the glass towers. The junior associate shifted his weight, glancing again at the meeting board, then at Marcus, recognition now clear in his expression, but still he hesitated. Naomi took her seat calmly, placing the leather folder in front of her. Marcus remained standing for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the back of the chair. Evelyn Whitmore cleared her throat politely. "Well, perhaps we should begin once everyone arrives," she said, her tone composed but slightly strained. Marcus looked toward her calmly. "Everyone is here." The words settled into the room with quiet weight. Tyler frowned, glancing around as if expecting someone else to step forward. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly, studying Marcus more carefully now, his instincts beginning to shift. The junior associate finally took a small step forward, then stopped himself again, uncertain whether to speak. Naomi opened her folder, her movements precise, unhurried. The clock on the wall clicked softly as the minute changed. Marcus pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, his posture relaxed but unmistakably authoritative, and the subtle confidence in his presence began to ripple across the room, turning curiosity into quiet tension as the Whitmore family realized something about this meeting was no longer unfolding the way they expected. Tyler Whitmore leaned back in his chair again, but the ease in his posture had begun to fracture, replaced by something quieter, more cautious, though he masked it with a faint smile. "Well then," he said, tapping the edge of the table lightly, "since we are all here, perhaps we should start with expectations." Richard Whitmore nodded slowly, still studying Marcus Ellington, trying to place the familiarity in his face. "Whitmore Capital is prepared to finalize the $750 million infrastructure expansion," Richard said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "We believe this partnership positions both sides for long-term growth." Naomi listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her gaze calm but attentive. Marcus glanced briefly at the folder but did not open it yet. Evelyn Whitmore offered a polished smile. "Of course, we are selective about who we partner with," she added, her tone measured but edged with pride. "We prefer organizations with a strong reputation and aligned values." Tyler smirked slightly, glancing at Naomi again. "And experience," he added. "This kind of scale is not for beginners." The junior associate near the coffee station shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension thickening, but no one acknowledged him. Marcus finally reached forward and opened the folder slowly, scanning the first page with quiet focus. The room remained still except for the faint hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 40 stories below. Richard Whitmore continued, filling the silence. "We have already secured municipal support across 3 states," he said. "New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. The timeline is aggressive but manageable." Naomi nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful. 36 months, she asked calmly. Richard blinked, surprised she spoke, then nodded. "Approximately." Tyler leaned forward, his tone casual but dismissive. "It is ambitious, but our partners typically trust our leadership." Naomi met his gaze evenly. "Trust usually follows performance." Tyler smiled thinly, unsure whether it was a challenge or a statement. Marcus turned another page, his eyes steady. "Funding structure appears heavily front-loaded," he said calmly. Richard nodded again. "That is correct. We expect your group to carry the initial capital exposure." Marcus closed the folder gently, resting his hands on top of it. "And risk allocation?" he asked. Evelyn responded smoothly. Shared, of course, though operational oversight would remain with Whitmore Capital. Naomi glanced at Marcus briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, subtle but unmistakable. Tyler noticed it and frowned slightly. Is there a concern? He asked, his tone tightening. Marcus looked up calmly. I always prefer clarity. The junior associate finally stepped forward, his voice hesitant. Sir, the board requested confirmation of. He stopped abruptly as Richard Whitmore raised a hand politely, but firmly. We will handle it internally, Richard said. The associate nodded and stepped back again, tension visible in his shoulders. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and steady. Your proposal assumes control without proportional accountability. Tyler gave a small laugh. That is how leadership works. Naomi held his gaze. That depends on who is leading. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, the sunlight outside fading into a deeper gold as the city prepared for evening. And within the quiet tension of the room, the balance of power began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways that the Whitmore family had not yet fully recognized. The silence lingered just long enough to shift from professional to uncomfortable, and Tyler Whitmore broke it with a faint chuckle that sounded more forced than confident. Look, he said, leaning forward again. We have done deals at this scale before. We understand how these negotiations work. Naomi did not respond immediately. Instead, she reached for a pen, flipping open the first page of her notes with a calm precision that contrasted sharply with Tyler's restless movements. Marcus remained still beside her, his presence steady, unreadable. Richard Whitmore folded his hands together, attempting to reclaim control of the room. Whitmore Capital has built infrastructure across 12 major metropolitan areas, he said. We do not take unnecessary risks. Naomi nodded slightly. That explains your confidence, she said quietly. Tyler smiled, sensing agreement, but the faint edge in her tone unsettled him. The junior associate near the coffee station shifted again, glancing toward Marcus, then toward Naomi, as recognition continued to grow in his expression. He stepped forward cautiously, his voice low. Excuse me, I believe there may be. He stopped again when Evelyn Whitmore gave him a polite but firm smile that did not invite interruption. We appreciate your attention, Evelyn said gently, but we are in the middle of a discussion. The associate nodded, stepping back once more, though his unease remained visible. Naomi turned another page, her voice calm. Your timeline depends heavily on municipal incentives, she said. Have all approvals been finalized? Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. They are expected, he replied. Naomi's gaze remained steady. Expected is not finalized. Tyler leaned forward, irritation creeping into his voice. With respect, that is standard procedure. Naomi met his eyes. Standard does not eliminate risk. The sunlight outside dimmed further, casting softer shadows across the polished table. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice measured. Your operational oversight request remains disproportionate. Evelyn tilted, her head slightly. We assumed your group preferred passive involvement. Naomi glanced at Marcus again, then back to Evelyn. Assumptions create misalignment. Tyler exhaled sharply. Then perhaps we should clarify roles. At that moment, the junior associate stepped forward again, unable to remain silent. Sir, I need to confirm whether Mr. Ellington. He stopped mid-sentence as Richard Whitmore's expression shifted slightly, curiosity flickering across his face. Ellington, Richard repeated slowly, turning toward Marcus. The room grew quieter. The associate nodded cautiously. Yes, sir. I believe. He hesitated again, but Naomi closed her folder gently, the soft sound echoing across the table. Marcus remained calm, his hands folded, his expression unchanged. Tyler glanced between them, confusion deepening. Wait, he said, his voice tightening slightly. Ellington infrastructure? Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her composure unwavering. Outside, the city lights began flickering on as dusk settled over Manhattan, and inside the conference lounge, the realization had not yet fully formed, but the first cracks in the Whitmore family's confidence were beginning to show as the quiet weight of a name they had underestimated started to reshape the entire room. The word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Ellington. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly, his fingers tapping once against the polished surface of the table, his eyes narrowing with a calculation that had replaced his earlier confidence. Tyler shifted in his seat, glancing between Naomi and Marcus, trying to connect the pieces before they fully formed. Ellington Infrastructure? Tyler repeated, his tone lighter than his expression. Naomi met his gaze calmly. Yes. The junior associate swallowed, stepping forward slightly. Sir, Ellington Infrastructure closed the Chicago Transit expansion last quarter, he said carefully, his voice steady but cautious. $720 million. Evelyn Whitmore's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Richard Whitmore nodded slowly, recognition now clear in his expression. I have read about that, he said, his tone measured. Tyler leaned back, forcing a faint smile. That still does not explain why she is leading the conversation, he said, gesturing toward Naomi. The words landed with a sharpness that shifted the air again. Naomi did not react immediately. She simply folded her hands, her composure intact. Marcus remained silent beside her, his expression unreadable. Tyler continued, sensing he had already stepped forward and now unwilling to retreat. No offense, he added, though the phrase carried little sincerity, but negotiations at this level usually involve senior leadership. The junior associate looked down, uncomfortable. Richard Whitmore glanced briefly at Tyler, but did not interrupt. Naomi's eyes remained steady, her voice calm when she finally spoke. Experience is not always defined by age. Tyler gave a short laugh. Sometimes it is defined by results. The room grew quieter. Naomi held his gaze without blinking. I agree. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Outside, headlights began moving across the streets below, tiny lines of motion in the fading light. Naomi's mind drifted for just a second, not away from the room, but backward. She remembered being 14 years old, standing beside her father at a charity gala in Boston, when a guest had handed her an empty glass and asked her to refill it. She remembered her father's calm silence, the way he had simply taken the glass, handed it back to the guest, and said quietly, "She is here with me." No anger, no raised voice, just clarity. That moment had stayed with her. Respect was not demanded loudly. It was revealed quietly. Tyler shifted again, misreading her silence. Look, he said, leaning forward again. We are prepared to move forward, but we need clarity on who is actually making decisions. Naomi glanced briefly at Marcus, then back to Tyler. You already have it. Richard Whitmore's gaze sharpened. Evelyn Whitmore's polite smile faded slightly. The junior associate looked up, anticipation growing. Marcus finally placed his hands flat on the table, his voice calm and steady. Perhaps we should address expectations before proceeding further. The subtle authority in his tone changed the rhythm of the room again. And for the first time since the meeting began, the Whitmore family realized that the conversation they thought they controlled was quietly slipping beyond their reach. Marcus Ellington's voice did not rise, yet it carried across the table with quiet authority that made everyone instinctively listen. Richard Whitmore straightened slightly, his earlier confidence now replaced by a careful attentiveness. Tyler Whitmore crossed his arms, though the gesture felt less certain than before. Naomi remained composed, her gaze steady as Marcus continued. Before we move forward, Marcus said calmly, we should align on expectations regarding leadership, accountability, and communication. Evelyn Whitmore nodded politely, though her expression had shifted from relaxed assurance to measured caution. Of course, she replied. We believe our structure already reflects that. Marcus glanced briefly at Naomi, then back at the Whitmore family. Your structure assumes unilateral oversight, he said. That is not how we operate. Tyler leaned forward, his tone defensive. We are offering operational expertise. Naomi responded quietly. And we are offering the capital foundation. The balance in the room shifted again. Richard Whitmore interlocked his fingers, considering carefully. Perhaps we can adjust oversight percentages, he offered, his voice more diplomatic now. Marcus shook his head slightly. This is not about percentages. Tyler frowned. Then what is it about? Marcus paused briefly, allowing the silence to build before answering. It is about alignment of values. The words landed softly but carried weight. Evelyn Whitmore's polite smile returned, though thinner than before. We value professionalism, she said. Naomi's expression remained calm. So do we. Outside, the last of the sunlight faded, and the glow of city lights reflected across the glass walls. The junior associate near the coffee station remained still, watching the exchange unfold with growing awareness. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but controlled. Partnerships at this level require trust from the very first interaction, he said. Tyler shifted again, sensing the subtle shift but still resisting it. We have been transparent from the beginning. Naomi met his gaze calmly. Transparency also includes how people are treated. The words hung in the air. Richard Whitmore glanced briefly toward Tyler, then back to Marcus, understanding beginning to form. Evelyn Whitmore's fingers tightened slightly around her coffee cup. Tyler exhaled quietly, his tone sharpening. If this is about earlier, he said, we were simply clarifying roles. Naomi's voice remained steady. Clarification does not require assumptions. Marcus folded his hands again, his expression composed. We pay attention to details, he added. The junior associate shifted again, his expression now unmistakably aware. Richard Whitmore nodded slowly, the realization deepening as the conversation moved beyond numbers and into something more significant. Tyler leaned back, the confidence in his posture fading further as he began to understand that the negotiation was no longer about structure or percentages, but about something that had already happened, something subtle yet decisive. And within the quiet tension of the conference lounge, the Whitmore family began to sense that the deal they believed was already within reach was now quietly slipping away. The room held its breath without anyone realizing it. Marcus. Ellington leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on the polished table, his eyes steady as he looked from Richard Whitmore to Evelyn, then finally to Tyler. Trust is built before contracts are signed, he said quietly. The words landed with a quiet finality. Tyler shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence now replaced by visible unease. Are you suggesting we have not been professional? He asked, trying to regain control. Naomi did not raise her voice. I am suggesting that first impressions matter. Richard Whitmore nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful now, as if replaying the last 15 minutes in his mind. Evelyn Whitmore set her cup down carefully, her fingers no longer as steady as before. If something was misunderstood, she began, her tone softer. We can certainly clarify. Marcus glanced briefly at Naomi before speaking again. There was no misunderstanding. The silence that followed felt heavier than any raised voice. Tyler exhaled slowly, his tone tightening. Then perhaps you should explain. Naomi leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her gaze unwavering. When I entered this room, she said calmly, I was told I did not belong here. Tyler opened his mouth, then paused. Evelyn's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Richard Whitmore looked down briefly, then back up, the realization settling in. Marcus's voice remained steady. You questioned her presence before you understood her role. The junior associate near the coffee station remained perfectly still, watching the moment unfold. Tyler attempted a faint smile, though it did not reach his eyes. We were simply verifying credentials. Naomi met his gaze calmly. Credentials were displayed on the meeting board. Richard Whitmore glanced toward the digital display again, where the name Ellington Infrastructure Group remained clearly visible. Evelyn exhaled quietly. Tyler leaned forward again, his voice softer now. If that came across the wrong way, that was not our intention. Marcus nodded slightly. Intent does not erase impact. The words settled across the table with quiet authority. Outside, the city lights reflected across the glass, turning the room into a mirror of muted gold and shadow. Naomi folded her hands gently. Partnerships begin with respect, she said. Richard Whitmore nodded slowly, his confidence now replaced by careful diplomacy. We value respect, he replied. Marcus looked at him calmly. So do we. The silence stretched again, and in that stillness, the balance shifted completely. Tyler leaned back, the realization finally settling in. That the conversation had moved beyond numbers and structures into something irreversible. Marcus placed his hand lightly on the closed folder, his voice calm but decisive. Before we proceed further, he said quietly, there is one clarification that should be made. He glanced briefly at Naomi, then back at the Whitmore family. Naomi Ellington is not simply part of this discussion. The room stilled again. Marcus's gaze remained steady. She is leading this deal. The words settled with unmistakable clarity, and the Whitmore family sat in silence as the full weight of what they had dismissed earlier finally became impossible to ignore. The silence after Marcus Ellington's words felt heavier than anything that had come before. Tyler Whitmore blinked slowly, the realization settling across his face as he looked from Marcus to Naomi, then back again, as if hoping he had misunderstood. Richard Whitmore straightened in his chair, his earlier confidence now replaced with careful restraint. Evelyn Whitmore lowered her gaze briefly before returning her attention to Naomi, her expression measured and composed. Naomi did not move. She remained calm, her posture relaxed, her hands folded lightly on the table as if nothing about the moment had surprised her. Tyler finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "You are leading the deal?" Naomi nodded once. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer left no room for interpretation. The junior associate near the coffee station looked down, almost relieved that the unspoken tension had finally surfaced. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat gently. "Well," he said carefully, "that certainly clarifies leadership." Naomi maintained her calm gaze. Leadership was already clear. Evelyn offered a polite smile, though it no longer carried the same certainty. "If there was any misunderstanding earlier, we regret that," she said softly. Marcus watched quietly, saying nothing, allowing Naomi to guide the moment. Tyler leaned forward slightly, his tone now measured. "Then perhaps we should move forward with the structure discussion." Naomi reached for the folder in front of her, opening it slowly. The sound of paper sliding across the polished table seemed louder in the quiet room. "We have reviewed your proposal," she said calmly. "There are several areas that require reconsideration." Richard nodded immediately, eager to stabilize the conversation. "We are open to adjustments." Naomi turned a page, her movements precise. "Operational oversight must be shared equally." Tyler nodded quickly. "That is reasonable." Naomi continued. "Capital exposure must be balanced proportionally." Evelyn nodded as well. "We can work with that." Naomi paused briefly, then closed the folder gently. The soft sound echoed across the room again. "However," she said quietly, "there is one remaining factor." The Whitmore family leaned forward slightly, anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Marcus remained still, his gaze steady. Naomi met their eyes calmly. "Partnerships depend on alignment," she said. Richard nodded cautiously. "We agree." Naomi's voice remained steady. "Alignment includes respect from the beginning." Tyler exhaled quietly, the weight of the conversation now unmistakable. Richard Whitmore's expression shifted, understanding fully settling in. Evelyn's polite smile faded into a thoughtful silence. Naomi folded her hands once more, her composure unchanged. "Given the concerns raised today," she continued calmly, "we will need to reassess whether this partnership aligns with our standards." The words landed softly but carried unmistakable finality. Tyler's eyes widened slightly. Richard leaned forward. "Reassess," he repeated quietly. Naomi nodded once, her gaze steady, and in that moment the Whitmore family realized that the deal they had walked in expecting to secure was no longer within their control, and the quiet collapse of their confidence unfolded in the stillness of the room as the weight of a single decision began to reshape everything. Richard Whitmore leaned forward slowly, his voice careful now, the confidence that had filled the room earlier replaced with quiet urgency. "Naomi, perhaps we should take a moment before making a final decision," he said. Naomi met his gaze calmly, her expression composed but resolute. "We have already taken that moment," she replied gently. Tyler Whitmore shifted in his seat, his earlier arrogance now completely gone. "If this is about earlier," he said, his tone subdued, "we can address that directly." Naomi nodded slightly. "You already did." The silence stretched again, heavy but controlled. Marcus Ellington remained still beside her, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. Evelyn Whitmore folded her hands carefully, her voice softer now. "We value long-term partnerships," she said. Naomi's eyes remained steady. "So do we." Outside, the lights of Manhattan glowed steadily, reflecting across the glass walls like a quiet reminder of the scale of decisions made in rooms like this. Naomi reached for her folder once more, closing it fully this time. The sound felt final. Richard Whitmore watched the motion carefully, understanding what it meant before she spoke. Given the importance of alignment, Naomi continued calmly, "We have decided not to proceed with this partnership." The words landed with quiet certainty. Tyler's shoulders lowered slightly as the reality settled in. Evelyn exhaled softly, her composed expression unable to fully hide the disappointment. Richard Whitmore nodded slowly, accepting the decision with restrained professionalism. "We respect your position," he said quietly. Marcus gave a slight nod, his expression calm. Naomi stood smoothly, her posture confident but respectful. "Thank you for your time," she said. The junior associate near the coffee station watched as the meeting came to its quiet conclusion, aware that he had just witnessed a decision that would ripple far beyond the room. Tyler remained seated for a moment longer, replaying the earlier moments in his mind, the casual comments, the assumptions, the subtle dismissal that had seemed insignificant at the time. Naomi gathered her folder calmly, her movements measured and deliberate. Marcus stood beside her, his presence steady as ever. As they turned toward the elevators, Richard Whitmore spoke one final time. "Naomi," he said quietly. She paused and turned back. "Yes." Richard met her gaze. "You handled this with remarkable professionalism." Naomi offered a calm, composed smile. "Respect makes decisions easier," she replied. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Naomi stepped forward, Marcus beside her. As the doors closed, the Whitmore family remained seated in the quiet conference lounge, the weight of a $750 million opportunity slipping away not because of numbers or strategy, but because of a moment that revealed more than any contract ever could. And in the stillness that followed, the lesson lingered with unmistakable clarity that real power did not need to raise its voice. It simply raised the standard.